Hello, and welcome to Season 4, Episode 6 of the ESG Experience, the podcast about all things ESG and beyond. Whether you're an ESG expert or just dipping your toes into the ESG universe, this podcast is for you. Together, we'll navigate the alphabet soup of ESG, share strategies, and discuss industry news and trends. I'm Helee Lev, SVP of ESG Operations at Conservice.
And I'm Ryan Nelson, SVP and General Manager of ESG at Conservice.
Today, we are fortunate enough to be joined by Janis Parthun, VP of Project Consulting Services at RGP, to discuss how companies are handling climate risks, navigating emerging climate reporting standards, as well as the challenges they face through the life cycle of ESG strategy implementation. Janis has a tremendous bio and a lot of experience, so we'll see how much she blushes as I read it. Luckily, it's just a podcast, so you can't see her blushing about her accomplishments, but Janis brings over 25 years of experience in finance, accounting, and risk management, primarily in professional services. She's a VP within RGP's Project Consulting Services team. She currently leads thought leadership and service innovation on emerging finance, accounting, and risk issues, engaging internal and external stakeholders across the US, Europe, and Asia Pacific. Previously, she was at an accounting firm leading attestation and internal control services for global and regional accounts within the risk consulting practice. She was also with the American Institute of CPAs, advocating the importance of accounting and IT to the accounting profession at large. This is my favorite part. Janis is active in her community through volunteer leadership efforts. This includes being an active member of the Institute of Management Accountant Sustainable Business Management Committee, and a board member of Plastic Free Restaurants. That's my favorite part. That's what I want to hear a little bit more about at some point during this podcast, which focuses on eliminating petroleum-based single-use plastic from restaurants. Please and thank you. Please, please, please do it. Get it done. And schools by subsidizing the purchase of reusable replacements. Love that. So welcome, Janis, and thank you for your work in the industry and your success to date. We're happy to have you.
Great. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, Ryan, Helee. It's great to have this conversation with you.
How are you today, Janis? Good?
Good. I'm doing great. It's a Friday, so I'm looking forward to the weekend. How about both of you?
Same, yes. Love my work, but also still enjoy the weekend. So yes, it's a good day. Helee, how are you?
I'm good. Had a nice week. We had a customer event in Newport Beach, so a little gloomy coming back to Chicago today where it's 38 and rainy, but I shall press through. I shall persevere.
Yes, California is nice. You're Northern California, Janis, is that right?
Yes. I'm in San Francisco. It's funny because a lot of times people think California, you have warm weather, but in the city proper, it's actually much cooler. On average. And so a lot of times, even in the summer when people come in, they end up leaving with SF sweatshirts and everything because they think that it's very warm, but it's actually very foggy. So
yeah, SF is cool. SF is no joke.
Yeah, so many Midwesterners have those SF fleeces that they got because they thought it was summer.
Yeah.
That's good. Well, maybe you could start by telling us a little bit more about RGP, if you would. Awesome company. I'm somewhat familiar. I doubt everybody knows RGP, although you are pretty meaningfully sizable. So you want to tell us about RGP?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So RGP is a global consulting company, and we serve 88% of the Fortune 100, and we really differentiate in terms of our delivery model as a more agile model and having to deploy to help clients in terms of transforming their business and workforce with speed and flexibility. And we specialize in code delivery on enterprise initiatives that typically is around, it could be business transformation and strategic transactions or regulatory changes, particularly around ESG. And we also have core expertise in finance and accounting, and we're seeing growing demand from clients that needs help in navigating, these complex ecosystems of regulations and standards that relates to ESG, as well as climate-related reporting disclosures.
Great. Yes. Transformation, change management at scale are very difficult things. So I can see why people would want to work with you. I checked out some of the dynamic workforce stuff I think that RGP is talking about, and that looked really cool. I'm super interested in how ESG reporting or the non-financial components are going to somehow stand up, next to financial components and really get the attention of the full C-suite. So that's very interesting to me. And then I really appreciate your kind of worldly point of view from RGP and from your experience. So that's going to be interesting today. So a question for you, as you mentioned, organizations are definitely receiving increased pressure to report on ESG matters. We're feeling that here in the States, our customers are feeling it. So what are the drivers for that increased pressure? And what are the challenges that organizations are facing in the course of implementing ESG and the climate-related reporting disclosures? So they're getting the pressure, and why, and then what challenges are the most immediate challenges they face?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Ryan. And there are a lot of increasing pressures to report on ESG matters. And it's really the different stakeholders that are driving this that I've been seeing so far. And one particular external driver is from the consumer and the end user. So, for example, with consumer products, there's been recent studies from McKinsey that shows that consumers are shifting their spending towards the products with the ESG related claims, and products that are making the ESG related claims, they're averaging a higher cumulative growth over a 5-year period. So that's a lot of data that can, be able to show that. And then that's also kind of a key reason for those companies that pushing ahead to try to be in front of the curve with ESG initiatives and to report on ESG commitments. But there are other external pressures as well, such as having to obtain capital. So internationally, there's over 150 billion net new money just generated in 2022, focused on sustainable funds, according to Morningstar. But then from a mergers and acquisition perspective, there's also a number of studies that's indicating that senior management, they're willing to pay premiums to purchase companies with positive ESG records. So, and then of course, internally, companies want to be able to drive and share how they're acting responsibly with their employees and customers and suppliers in the environment. So I'd say that's, those are some of the key external drivers. And then I'll just also highlight, just in terms of from a climate reporting specifically, that from that perspective, the driver for that ultimately is around climate change. With extreme weather and the global temperatures rising, and then having to have kind of a one threshold that's universally agreed upon from the Paris Agreement in 2015, having to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That has also been a driver, so that essentially now organizations need to be able to understand where and how much they're generating the emissions, for one thing, and then two, be able to aim to reduce the emissions. So those are some of the different drivers that, from an external perspective.
Yeah. So the fact that humans need a place to live is one of the drivers. And then
yet many humans don't yet believe that their home is in threat. So I feel like we have to step back from that.
That's got to be, hopefully that's the marginal remaining factor now, but yes, but we need a place to live. And then what it's always promising to me is we're like, well, who's driving all this stuff? And one of the great answers is consumers. Well, what does that mean? Us, that person over there, and me, and this, everybody.
Yeah.
The businesses are made up of humans, and then those humans have kids and grandkids, and then there's us, and we're like, people demand this. So if everyone's demanding it, then yeah, business is going to have to fall in line. So that's promising to me. So fine, somebody gets it, we got to do this, and then an organization wants to do it. they're like, okay, one of the things we have to do is report on, disclose things. What's kind of the initial challenge or hurdle, or what's the top thing that says, okay, now what for an organization to get started?
Yeah, there are multiple factors I want to just highlight here, but one is that there are multiple approaches to voluntary reporting. And so companies in the same industry, they can take different stance or different positions on voluntarily reporting their ESG efforts, since it's a little bit more strategic in nature, and organizations, as they're sharing the ESG efforts and ESG or impact reports or on their websites. And this really just creates variations across the industries and sectors. It's almost like comparing apples and oranges. If the investors or stakeholders are trying to compare how companies are addressing ESG matters within a retail industry or airline industry, they're just different ways of presenting this, because many of the guidance have been voluntary. And so because of this, companies can be evaluated differently, and you have to tackle this challenge. Do you decide to report on one voluntary standard or another, or multiple, or mapping and indexing? Another one I want to just call out is establishing the program governance and structure. And it's really key to be able to establish the program governance and the structure and involve the board as well as the management of the to have internal oversight, essentially. And this can be challenging because you're involving many more key stakeholders, and it's across multiple functions and leadership teams. And how this can be established can also have implications in the reliance of the information. So, and I mentioned about, talking about the consumer demand, but actually the European Commission, they had recently highlighted that over 50% of an examined environmental claims in a study that they had conducted is found to be vague and misleading and unfounded. And so because of this, they proposed a specific rule to address it. But this, in terms of not necessarily having the appropriate structure, can also lead to issues. So another example is that this is a lessons learned for a retail company. Last year, in terms of what happened to them, where there's an organization that they lack the appropriate program governance and structure. And in this instance, the apparel company was investigated by regulators for misrepresenting sustainability-related products. And they had to remove the labels from their products and websites and essentially just pull the products off the shelf. So it can be an issue when there's not necessarily enough or appropriate governance and structure around this.
Yeah.
And then two other things I want to just call out. Obviously, the data availability and the quality of things, that can be another challenge. Is the data available? Can the data be relied upon? If a company's in the earlier stages of the maturity, you might have to try and find the data and see if the data is available. But then as the company matures, the attention really focuses more on the quality of the data. Is it complete or accurate? Yeah. And, with all this happening, this is where the regulators are really coming in, because they're really stepping in to try and help to help confirm these activities, to help improve and push for that higher level data quality as well. So.
Yeah. And don't we know it? I mean, that is the wrapper of our entire business. So, as we mentioned in the pre-call, Conservice is working on data for the commercial real estate, so the built environment, which is responsible for a lot of the emissions and which will play a key role in the reduction and whether or not we meet the targets from the Paris Agreement. And I think that as we talk to our customers, folks agree that you guys want to run your business, you need good data partners to just manage the data and make sense of the data. And to your point, Janis, it needs to be accurate, right? So it's nice when you have partners where you say, give me all the data and then let me focus on the insights, let me focus on the strategy, let me focus on how we're tracking towards our goals. So that's important. And then you mentioned before, I always talk about it as well, of course, there's the overarching existential crisis that we're faced with as, to having a place to live. But the push is three ways. It's the push down from, say, investors or the public markets or other stakeholders. It's the push up, grassroots from the employees themselves that say, I want to work for an organization that is ESG minded. And then I kind of call it the side push is the regulators, right? So there's all this different regulation and compliance, and it made this perfect storm being pushed from all sides, where we really saw an inflection point on the focus of ESG, the importance of ESG, companies, it becoming really a C-suite issue instead of an off to the side issue. So I want to spend some time with you, since you're an expert on what I call the side push. So not the grassroots of the employees coming up, not the top down of the investors and public markets and other stakeholders, but the regulator push that's going to squeeze you from the sides. So talk to us a bit about regulations. It can be in different standards. It can be intimidating. You can be fined, right, if you don't comply. So what's your advice, to both, I'd say, startup or early stage companies, to full-blown, mature organizations, public companies, when it comes to regulation?
Yeah, no, thanks for highlighting that, Helee. And regulations really it's starting to become more challenging and complex, just with all the different variations that's coming out. And so maybe let me spend a little bit of time just walking through some of the key regulations so you can get some perspective. And then especially, so for the US, there are three in particular that I think it's important to just highlight. And it's all climate focused. But then when you start stepping into from an international requirement perspective, it really then expands beyond that. It's beyond climate. It really covers a broader spectrum. So I want to just initially talk through that a little bit. So in terms of the US, you have more from a federal level, which is the SEC. And the SEC is the US Security Exchange Commission, for a little bit of background. And it's an independent agency for the federal government. And its role really is to protect investors and facilitate market formation. And it has the power to enforce requirements with public companies. So this is more public company focused in terms of the proposed rule. But in March of last year, the SEC had proposed rules to enhance and standardize climate-related disclosures, partially just because the investor community is just demanding for this, to have a more consistent, more comparable, reliable information across companies to evaluate, because many of them are already reporting it anyway. It's just they're reporting it in their own way. And so that was part of the reason. And then the proposed disclosures would require companies to disclose on their governance, on their strategy, risk management, and targets around climate, but specifically also on greenhouse gas emissions. And then the elements that are really most sensitive for the registrants or for the companies are the assurance requirements for larger entities, and then having to estimate the financial impact for possible climate-related events. And that can be sometimes hard to try and capture that information on a yearly basis, especially sometimes it's just a business deal and you have to know what your business is doing throughout the whole year and capture that information. But the biggest concern really is around scope 3 emissions, having to report scope 3. So that's been a lot of concerns on that. From a timing perspective, this was supposed to finalize last year, but we haven't seen this yet. I would say, however, now at the state level for the California state, California state's also been pushing for companies to report on organizations' climate impact, and they issued 2 state bills to require companies to report their carbon emissions related activities. And it's now officially into law. It was signed into law in October. So one is the SB 253, the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act. And the requirements really are for companies to disclose emissions starting in 2026, along with assurance requirements and in alignment with the greenhouse gas protocol. And so This applies to companies with revenues greater than 1 billion that where they do business in California, whether public or private. So this is beyond SEC. This is also private companies, but this is also all revenue. It's not just revenue that's earned in California. So depending on if they have employees there or if they have sales within California, then this would apply. And the timing perspective, so I mentioned about 2026, but this really equates to gathering your information, your 2025 data, which is not that far away. I mean, we're already at the end of 2023, so it's really not that far away, and it would require some effort. Just if your organization hasn't been focused on this issue or considered as a priority before. And then the second one, the SB 261, which is the greenhouse climate-related financial risk. This requirement is disclosing climate-related financial risk starting in 2026. And this one applies to U.S. companies that do business in California with revenues greater than 500 million. So a bit lower on the threshold. So, but I would just say, just from a U.S. perspective, when you're having to think about all that together, the California climate disclosure bills are now signed into law, and this is really going to accelerate and recognize that climate reporting requirements are materializing in the U.S. The U.S., a lot of companies have been anticipating what the SEC is going to do, what's going to be finalized, but California really just jumped ahead in signing the bill. So, and that's just the U.S. perspective.
Sure, I can see that getting started might be difficult. What's the paralysis by analysis, or just too many choices, or it's like, how do I even start because this seems so complicated? So, yeah, I think that's one interesting component. And then I do think people are feeling that pressure now. Organizations are feeling that pressure because these dates that used to be so far out, and we're typically, a lot of people are procrastinators. I'm sure that we all have seen in our lives. And when you say something like 2050 or 2030, you're like, okay, I'll deal with that later.
Right.
But like 2025 is 13 months away, right? Like that starts to be like that. So 2030 is real soon. It's going to feel pretty close, sooner than later here. And some of these things are longer than 12-month projects. I mean, if you want to report, I think you could do that in a calendar year. But if you need to report and then implement, you probably need to be thinking about multi-year programs here. So I do think that pressure's becoming real for everyone. Our company boards, I think I would know the answer then, but at the board level, is there a particular role or someone who's owning this or engaged in overseeing climate risk, or is this still something that's just coming from management somewhere in the organization?
Well, I would say from a company board perspective, it really is important for them to be involved. I mean, the boards need to be involved in this process, and oversight is needed. So as the company's releasing their sustainable business information out to the markets and external stakeholders, either for regulatory requirements or just to address the market demands, there really needs to be oversight on disclosing this information. And besides that, it's also required in the regulations as well. So specifically for the climate disclosures, one of the requirements is to describe the board oversight and the governance around this. And this includes identifying who's responsible, as well as the related expertise on climate risk. But I would also just want to add that I also understand that not all the board members are comfortable with the topic around greenhouse gas emissions or how to best provide oversight. So, and actually, this was interesting. There was a recent survey that NASDAQ had put together, and they had gathered that over 2/3 of the board surveys that they agree that a coherent ESG strategy makes it with clear priorities really help provide organizational value and strong financial outcomes. But then half of them note that there's really opportunities to enhance the education on how to address environmental concerns. And so I think there's besides having boards involved in this, I think boards also need to be educated around this. So that's kind of what I wanted to mention here. And then to have that, the board having to have the oversight, they really need to have the knowledge base and the skill set in order to be effective. So.
Yeah. And have you seen, like, in the time that you've been in the space, have you seen a shift in this? Are board members getting the education they need? Is there, there'll still be some naysayers, and unfortunately ESG is now a political issue. So some of them, without even understanding, attach themselves to a political concept that has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with science. But that being said, have you seen a shift? How do you speak to, what are suggestions on how to educate people without it being combative? And when it comes to, the board, what do you feel is how much of this is their responsibility versus the operators of the company? Like, so I guess what I'm trying to ask, when we make these aspirational goals for, say, the year 2050, conveniently a year that people will be retired or long gone, or whoever had initially committed to doing that will no longer be, who's gonna be left holding the bag? Who's responsible? So yeah, just talk about the dynamics, if you don't mind, and what you foresee.
No, it's a great question. And just in terms of, I think it's the board's responsibility. It's also management responsibility, right? And management need to also be involved in this process. But in terms of specifically around the board, and just in terms of the conversations I've had with clients, data points that I have seen, majority of boards are getting involved. There is a small percentage, as you mentioned, just from more, it could be politics, could be other things, but there is a small percentage of board members who may not necessarily be involved in ESG matters from an ongoing basis, but majority of the board members are involved. And plus, with the regulators really pushing these requirements, there is pressure, for example, from audit committees to participate more and have an understanding what organizations are doing. And then from a management perspective, there's really a push to form committees, form internal oversight on this information. And so I think that's been key as well. And then also, I just wanted to add that in terms of, besides the tactical approach of having to have management involved and having to have oversight, really finance and accounting professionals are also getting more involved in varying degrees. And because finance and accounting professionals are very familiar with the governance structures, and having to put that together, in the past with new regulations coming out, and having to have that structure and rigor to be able to have that completeness and that getting to the level of the completeness and accuracy of the information. So I've really seen a lot of this experience and value translate from financial reporting to ESG reporting. And within the finance organization, historically, controllership functions may be familiar with implementing new reporting requirements, working with multiple stakeholders, and then at the same time provide that structure and rigor. And this could be having to put policies and procedures in place, having to develop that for data collection with associated reviewers and workflows with sign-off, and then building supporting structure, and just having to have centralized communication of requirements, which might include dates, process sources, training, just having that knowledge and governance and putting that structure in place, and have that apply that to ESG reporting. So really the same attributes can apply as well for the operational reporting. So especially with goals and targets, it's like having to have that the strategic reporting and FP&A analysis skill set incorporated into that to set the goals and targets and making sure it's monitored, so that really bringing that structure and precision into the process.
Got it.
Yeah, so sounds like from the board level perspective, just to recap a little bit, from the board level perspective, if the board is not involved, they should be involved at this point. This is essentially what I'm hearing. So
Yes.
organizations who don't have this, either an oversight person assigned or have something on the agenda, related to climate risk and required reporting and those kind of things, that they should, and they should somehow get themselves trained and up to speed on how to approach these things. So that's great. I think, like you, what I'm hearing is I really appreciate the finance and accounting part of organizations getting involved now. A little history for me, I started and worked for small companies, and I never had the fortune of like FP&A. It was always like, well, type it here in QuickBooks and then send it over to the accounting team, and then they'll do the accounting work once a year, sort of thing. But understanding, financial planning and analysis, that's FP&A, right? Financial planning and analysis. Yes. I knew that. I was sharing for everyone else. No, yeah, FP&A, having that kind of skill set available. And we're talking a lot here. What some of this regulation is starting with the largest organizations. I think it sounds like from, what you said when you're talking about the SEC, those public organizations are large. You just said $1 billion in revenue, 500 million in revenue. So medium, large organizations who I'm sure have some sort of FP&A involved. So for that group to put some structure to this, to be able to look at that type of data from a lens of how they look at financial data, I think the FP&A type personnel will understand this very well, and then be able to help us plan, help the board, help the management, and all that kind of thing. So I'm really excited to see it going that way, and having some sort of standard document that leaders in an organization and then external stakeholders can read and understand. And then when they look at another companies, they can say, oh, I'm starting to get familiar with this format, so I can make sense of the ESG matters at this company versus this company versus this company. So that's all very promising for me. So then controls, can we talk a little specifically? Can you give an example, like what kind of controls are businesses supposed to change everything they're doing? Or is this just about, for now, business as usual, but you have to start collecting certain data points? Or what are these integral controls or processes that some organization might need to put in place? I guess if you could tell us an example.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to, Ryan. And so I would say, in terms of controls and processes and procedures, it'll vary depending on what the data set is. But if we want to talk more specifically around greenhouse gas emissions, this and having this information to be audit ready, to have governance, but then also to be ready for assurance purposes. You likely want to first prioritize what information that's disclosed maybe at a higher risk versus not. And so looking at, for example, if the requirements is suggesting for scope 1 and scope 2, initially, that likely will be something that you would want to prioritize, and then obviously focus on scope 3 as a second tier, things of that sort. But then having policies and procedures in place to support the current processes, and have checks and balances in place, or segregation of duties in the processes. So let's say, if we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, do you have an inventory management plan that's in place, that's documented, well documented, defining who owns what, defining in terms of, are there steps in place that someone is reviewing the information versus someone who is collecting the information? Is there methodology that's being described within the inventory management plan that is reviewed annually. Someone is going through and looking at this annually to be able to confirm that this is the purge that we're going through consistently. And then it could be also across, if for larger entities where they may have different subsidiaries or different regions, is that being consistently applied across the different business units? So it's important to be able to understand that. It's also important to be able to use the relevant information and be able to create a traceable audit trail. And so having to be able to incorporate the review and approval process, but have that audit trail with it, so that information is meaningful, and that also represents a company's actual underlying activities. The other aspect that I just want to mention is to have some sort of monitoring system that can support, essentially, if you're wanting to have a strategic reassessment or help a company reflect on its commitment on a periodic basis, it would be helpful to have that periodically, especially also you're wanting to check to see if you're aligning to your goals. Let's say if you set a goal or a target for 2030, but you want to still keep track on top of it. You don't want to find out that you're 75% behind and midway point. So
yeah, you got to have a pace that you're working towards. Even if it's a 2030 goal, you need to start setting milestone checkpoints, right?
Yes. And then one other thing I do want to call out separately that I think it's really important is to educate process and data owners who might not have been previously involved, more so from audit or regulatory reporting perspective. Because, so for example, we're having to go to someone from real estate or facilities. They may not necessarily have gone through that type of audit or regulatory reporting perspective. And it's important to educate others on what controls mean, and so that you can really achieve that level of detail and the quality that's expected. So, and I think this is where it's helpful to have finance and internal control functions to be involved, because they can also help educate the process and the data owners on this, because they've gone through this before. So.
Got it.
Makes sense. So Janis, I wanted to save some time to talk about your extracurriculars because it's very interesting to me. The plastic and takeout in restaurants and in schools is an interesting one. And I lament, probably along with everyone, every time that I take out food and there's all this extra sauce that I don't need and the extra utensils when I'm bringing it to my house. And I know some restaurants have started at least giving you the option. Like, I think you have to opt out. It would be better if you had to opt in to the plastic. But why, of all the noble and worthy ESG causes on earth, did you specifically pick that one? And is there hope?
Well, that's a great question, Helee. And since I've gotten involved, I've really learned a lot about this space as well. And it's been interesting because there's also particular plastics that you want to be cautious about, or there are different variations of it and different variations that of compostable, and it's just something that you can see day to day, especially when you go to takeout, but also at schools. There's so many kids that's having to have lunches at the cafeteria, and a lot of times you're just throwing out all these materials, and I think that's kind of where,
they just take the tray and just dump the tray.
Yeah. That's where, I thought, well, if I can make at least some impact, this is what I'm going to get involved in and participate in. And so far we've been very successful, I would say, more at schools, because it's also something that if they have a cafeteria, it's easily to be able to replace that with steel or more sustainable materials that can be reused ongoing basis. And so we've actually been able to work with a lot of the schools to subsidize so that they can be able to invest and purchase those materials and replace that. So especially if you think about high schools or middle schools, there's 1,000 kids in schools having to do that, have lunch, throw away their materials on a daily basis. And if we can even replace that and have that, have them reuse the plates and the utensils on a daily basis, that's at least a little bit of help in terms of reducing our waste. And I think that was what made it interesting for me to participate in.
That's awesome.
Very cool.
And yeah, that's amazing. And do you feel like you're making a lot of progress, or is it really slow, like district by district? Is it grassroots, or is there some sort of organization you can work with where you can roll it out more widespread, or does it feel like a grassroots effort?
I would say it's still both.
Yeah.
It's still grassroots effort, but then we also do partner with other associations as well in the effort to be able to get more schools to participate in this. I would say restaurants still a little bit harder to have them convert on that, but it is still a work in progress, ideally.
I went for a breakfast sandwich this morning and I got it for here, and they usually put it on a plate. So sandwich, plate, awesome. And I give the plate back, they wash it. Today, this is a controls process they messed up. They flagged that as to go. And I'm looking at it, so it's got a sandwich with a wrap, with another tinfoil wrap, with the bag, put in a bag with the napkins. I'm like, man, like I wanted the sandwich on a plate. Like all this, and like now it's on me that I'm gonna walk over there and throw all this stuff away. I didn't want it. So yeah, you got to have the controls in place too, even if you have the right intentions. So, well, obviously, Janis, you have a wealth of knowledge on this stuff, and we just scratched the surface on the types of regulations there are, I'm sure, across the world, let alone in the US. But hopefully our listeners understand that it's happening, it's real, it's important, it's at the board level. Thanks to the consumers for driving us to do this sort of thing. Before we wrap, let's have some fun here for a second. I got a real easy game we want to play with you. In the world of creators and artisan and craft things, we came up with this game. It's called Beans or Barley. And those are your two options. You're basically saying, is the input of this company I'm about to tell you, I'm going to say a company name, and you basically tell me, do they make beer or coffee? That's all you got to do. Is it beans or barley, beer or coffee? Okay. I'm going to tell you this company name, and then I'm going to explain why I picked this company. Okay. So do they make beer or coffee, beans or barley? The company is called Equator.
Oh, beans.
That's
coffee.
Right. You know it? Do you know it?
Yes. I've had their coffee there. So
Cool. Yeah, I picked it. A couple of reasons from an ESG perspective. I appreciate that it's a woman-founded company. It's out of a garage in Marin County, so not too far from you. In 1995, Equator Coffees marked the beginning of a high-impact coffee company focused on quality, sustainability, and social responsibility. I really like this quote. Equator was named after the region where coffee grows, but has come to mean so much more than that. Is it's the path around the planet that connects us all. So I thought that was cool. And they've been a certified, talk about voluntary things. They've been a certified B Corp since 2011. So I feel like that's pretty early in the certified B Corp thing, which is something that I think is cool. So anyway, thanks for playing that game. And very nice to meet you and hear from you today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on this podcast. I'm just personally passionate about ESG, and so I appreciate you having me on this session.
Excellent.
All right. This
Take
has
us
been
out,
another
Helee.
episode. Yes, I had to get to that page past all the meat and notes of this information-filled podcast. So this has been another episode of the ESG Experience podcast. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed your time with us, make sure to subscribe at your favorite podcast directory. There's a new episode every month. We appreciate our loyal subscribers and listeners for continuing to support our podcast. And if you want to continue the conversation between episodes, follow us on your favorite social media channel at #ESG Experience. Thank you, Janis. We appreciate it. It's nice to meet you. Take care.
Thanks, Janis. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you. Thanks.
Bye-bye.